The city was always busy, filled with bright lights, tall buildings, and people rushing from one place to another. But for Ethan, it was just a cold and lonely place. He had no home, no warm bed, and no family to call his own. Every night, he slept wherever he could find shelter, under bridges, in empty doorways, or on a park bench. His only companion in this tough life was Rusty, a small stray dog with golden fur and kind eyes. Rusty had been with him for as long as he could remember. And no matter how hard things got, Ethan refused to leave him behind. Ethan wasn't always homeless. A few years ago, he had a home, a family, and a normal life. But everything changed when his parents passed away in an accident. With no close relatives to take him in, he ended up in a foster home. It wasn't a bad place, but it never felt like home. The other kids had their own groups, and he often felt like an outsider. One day, he heard the social workers talking about sending him to a different home, one that didn't allow pets. That was when he made the hardest decision of his life. He ran away. Life on the streets was not easy. Every day was a struggle to find food and a safe place to sleep. Ethan learned how to survive by doing small jobs like carrying grocery bags, cleaning car windows, and sometimes just relying on the kindness of strangers. But kindness wasn't something he saw often. Most people ignored him, pretending he didn't exist. Others looked at him with pity or suspicion, as if he was a troublemaker. Despite everything, Ethan never lost hope. He had dreams, just like any other kid. He wanted to go to school, have friends, and live in a real home again. But more than anything, he wanted to make sure Rusty was safe. No matter how little food he found, he always shared it with Rusty first. The little dog was his only family, the only one who stayed by his side through everything. One evening, the cold wind blew through the streets, making Ethan shiver. He pulled his thin jacket tighter around himself and walked toward the back of a restaurant, hoping to find some leftover food. The smell of warm bread and roasted meat filled the air, making his empty stomach ache. But when he got there, he saw that the trash bins were already locked. Disappointed, he turned away. But just then, a kind old man working in the kitchen noticed him. The man came outside with a small paper bag and handed it to Ethan with a smile. "Here, kid. It's not much, but it'll help," the man said kindly. Ethan's eyes lit up as he took the bag. "Thank you, sir," he said gratefully. He opened it to find a piece of bread and a few chicken strips. It wasn't a feast, but to him, it was like gold. He quickly walked back to the alley where Rusty was waiting. The little dog wagged his tail excitedly as Ethan tore the bread in half, giving Rusty the bigger piece. As they ate, Ethan looked up at the sky. The stars were bright tonight, and for a moment, he allowed himself to dream. Maybe one day, things would change. Maybe one day, he wouldn't have to sleep on the cold ground. He didn't know how or when, but he still believed that something good was waiting for him. That night, as Ethan curled up with Rusty beside him, he had no idea that the next 24 hours would change his life forever. Ethan walked through the quiet streets, his hands tucked into his pockets to keep warm. The night air was chilly, and a light breeze made it even colder. Rusty trotted beside him, his tail wagging slightly as they searched for a safe place to sleep. They had just eaten a little while ago, thanks to the kind old man from the restaurant, but the night was far from over. Ethan had learned over time that the city never truly slept. Cars still moved, lights still glowed, and people still walked around, though not as many as during the day. Some were heading home from late shifts, others were out having fun, but no one paid attention to a homeless boy and his dog. He was invisible to them, just another shadow in the city. As he turned onto a quieter street, something caught his eye. In the distance, beyond the rows of tall buildings, he saw a thick cloud of smoke rising into the night sky. At first, he thought it was just another chimney, but then he noticed the color, dark and heavy, mixing with an orange glow. It wasn't just smoke, it was fire. His heart started pounding. Fires weren't common in the city, and if there was one, It meant someone could be in trouble. He hesitated for a moment, not sure what to do. It wasn't his problem, and getting involved could be dangerous. But then he heard something that made his decision for him. A scream. A child's scream. Ethan's body moved before his mind could even think. Without a second thought, he ran toward the sound, Rusty following close behind. As he got closer, he saw the source of the fire. A large, beautiful house with tall white pillars and a massive front yard. Flames had already spread across the second floor, and black smoke poured from the windows. People were gathered outside, some shouting, some on their phones, but no one was running in. Then he heard it again, a terrified cry coming from inside the house. A girl. She was still trapped. Ethan's stomach twisted. He looked around, expecting someone to rush in and save her, but no one did. The adults stood frozen, their faces filled with fear, waiting for the fire department. But Ethan knew that by the time help arrived, it could be too late. He didn't have time to think. He sprinted forward, ignoring the voices shouting for him to stop. The heat hit him as he neared the burning house, and smoke stung his eyes. But he kept going. His feet barely touched the ground as he ran around to the side of the house, looking for a way in. That's when he saw her. A girl, no older than 10, stood on a small balcony, coughing and crying. The flames were behind her, creeping closer. She looked down, her face pale with fear. Their eyes met, and for a brief second, time seemed to stop. Then she screamed again. Ethan didn't hesitate. He spotted a tree growing near the side of the house, its branches reaching toward the balcony. Without thinking, he grabbed onto the lowest branch and pulled himself up. His hands burned from the rough bark, but he kept climbing. Smoke filled his lungs, making it hard to breathe. But he didn't stop. Below, he heard the crowd gasping. Someone yelled for him to come down, but he ignored them. He wasn't thinking about the danger. He was only thinking about the girl. As he reached the highest branch, he carefully leaned forward and stretched his hand toward her. "Come on," he shouted over the roar of the fire. "Take my hand." The girl hesitated for only a second before reaching out. Their fingers brushed, and then, with all the strength he had, Ethan pulled her toward him. She clung to him, shaking, as he started to climb down. The fire crackled louder, sending more smoke into the sky. But Ethan didn't look back. He just held onto the girl tightly, praying he could get them both to safety before it was too late. Ethan held onto the girl tightly as he carefully climbed down the tree. The rough bark scratched his hands, and his arms ached from pulling both of their weight. But he didn't stop. The fire behind them roared louder, filling the air with thick black smoke. The girl clung to him, coughing and trembling, her small hands gripping his jacket like she was afraid to let go. Below them, people were shouting. Some were calling for help. Others were crying out in panic. The flashing lights of the fire trucks had appeared at the end of the street, but Ethan knew they weren't fast enough. If he hadn't climbed up, the girl would have been trapped. As he reached the lower branches, he took a deep breath and looked down. The ground was still a little far, but there was no time to climb carefully. The flames were spreading, and the heat was unbearable. He held the girl close and spoke softly. "Hold on tight," he said. "We have to jump." The girl's eyes widened in fear, but she nodded. Without another second of hesitation, Ethan let go of the branch and dropped to the ground. The landing was hard. His legs buckled as they hit the ground, and pain shot through his ankle, but he ignored it. He kept his arms wrapped around the girl, making sure she didn't get hurt. The moment they landed, the crowd erupted into gasps and shouts. Someone ran forward. A woman, her face streaked with tears. Olivia. The woman cried as she rushed toward them. She dropped to her knees and wrapped her arms around the girl, sobbing with relief. The girl, Olivia, clung to her mother and cried into her shoulder. Ethan stepped back, suddenly feeling out of place. His heart was still racing from the fear and adrenaline, but seeing Olivia safe made it all worth it. He turned his head and saw Rusty standing nearby, his tail wagging, as if making sure Ethan was okay. The fire trucks finally reached the house. Firefighters rushed out, spraying water onto the burning building. The flames hissed and crackled as the water hit them, but Ethan didn't watch for long. Now that the girl was safe, he didn't feel like he belonged there anymore. Just as he was about to slip away, a strong voice called out, "Wait!" Ethan froze. A tall man in an expensive suit pushed through the crowd, his face filled with shock and gratitude. His hair was messy, and his expensive shoes were covered in ash. It was clear he had run out of the house in a hurry. The moment he saw Olivia in her mother's arms, his expression changed. He dropped to his knees beside them, pulling his daughter into a tight hug. "Olivia, my baby, are you okay?" Olivia nodded weakly. "The boy, he saved me," she whispered, looking up at Ethan. The man turned toward Ethan, his eyes filled with emotion. For a moment, he just stared at him, as if trying to understand how a boy from the streets had just risked his life to save his daughter. Then, without hesitation, he stepped forward. "You saved my little girl," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't even know how to thank you." Ethan shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't used to attention, and he didn't know what to say. I just did what anyone would do," he muttered. But the man shook his head. "No," he said firmly. "Not everyone would have done what you did." Ethan felt his heart beat faster. He didn't know what was going to happen next, but for the first time in a long time, someone was truly looking at him, not as a homeless boy, but as a hero. Ethan stood awkwardly as the tall man looked at him with deep gratitude. The fire behind them was finally dying down as the firefighters worked hard to put it out. The thick smoke still lingered in the air, making it hard to breathe, but Ethan hardly noticed. His heart was still racing, and his hands were sore from climbing the tree. He just wanted to leave before anyone asked too many questions. But before he could take a step back, the man spoke again. "You saved my daughter's life," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "I don't even know your name." Ethan hesitated. He wasn't sure if he should say anything. People usually didn't care about who he was. But the way the man looked at him, it wasn't like the others who passed him by on the street. It wasn't pity or suspicion. It was something else. "Ethan," he finally said. "My name is Ethan." The man nodded, as if memorizing it. "Ethan," he repeated. "I'm James Caldwell. This is my wife, Emily, and our daughter, Olivia." Ethan glanced at Olivia, who was still clinging to her mother. Her face was smudged with ash, and her eyes were red from crying, but she managed to give him a small smile. "Thank you," she whispered. Ethan didn't know what to say, so he just gave a small nod. He didn't save her for a reward or recognition. He saved her because she needed help. That's what mattered. James took a deep breath and turned to Ethan again. "You were willing to risk your life for my daughter," he said. "That's something I will never forget." Ethan shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't used to people talking to him this way. Most of the time, adults either ignored him or told him to stay away. He had no idea what to say now. James continued, "I want to do something for you, Ethan. Please, let me help you." At those words, Ethan's chest tightened. He had heard promises before. He had been told that people wanted to help, but in the end, they always walked away. He had learned long ago not to expect too much. "I don't need anything," Ethan said quickly. "I'm fine." James looked surprised. "But you don't even have a home. Where do you live?" Ethan glanced at Rusty, who was sitting patiently by his feet. "Wherever I can," he answered simply. "I get by." Emily, Olivia's mother, placed a gentle hand on her husband's arm. "James, he's just a child. We can't let him go back to the streets after what he's done." James nodded, then turned back to Ethan. "Please," he said, "come with us. You don't have to sleep outside anymore. I can give you a home, a warm bed, food, whatever you need." Ethan's heart pounded. A home. A warm bed. For a moment, he imagined what it would be like to have a roof over his head, clean clothes, and regular meals. It was everything he had once dreamed of. But then he looked down at Rusty. The little dog had been his only family for as long as he could remember. If he went with them, would they let him keep Rusty? What if things didn't work out? What if they changed their minds later? Doubt filled his mind. He had survived on his own for so long. Could he really trust these people, even if they seemed kind? Ethan took a step back. I don't know, he said hesitantly. James didn't look disappointed. Instead, he gave Ethan a small smile. You don't have to decide right now, he said. But just know, our door is always open for you. Ethan nodded but didn't say anything. He wasn't sure what to believe. He had spent so long being invisible to the world. Now suddenly, a wealthy family wanted to take him in. It almost felt too good to be true. As the firefighters continued to work, Ethan knew one thing for sure. His life would never be the same again. Ethan sat on the cold pavement, his back resting against a lamppost as he watched the last of the fire die down. The once beautiful house was now covered in black soot, its windows broken, and parts of the roof had collapsed. Firefighters were still working, spraying water over the smoldering remains, while a few police officers talked to the Caldwell family. Rusty lay beside Ethan, his small body curled up against his leg for warmth. The little dog yawned and rested his head on Ethan's knee, completely unaware of the life-changing moment that had just happened. Ethan's mind was racing. James Caldwell had offered him something he had never expected, a home. A real home. Not a shelter, not a temporary place, but a real family. The thought of sleeping in a warm bed, eating regular meals, and not having to worry about where he would spend the night was almost too much to believe. But was it real? People had made promises to him before. Some had given him food and said they would come back to help, but they never did. Others had said kind words but kept their distance. What if James was just saying this because of the moment? What if after a few days he changed his mind? Ethan sighed and rubbed his hands together to warm them up. He had survived this long on his own. Did he really need help now? Just then, he heard footsteps approaching. He looked up and saw James Caldwell walking toward him. Unlike before, when he had been filled with panic and worry, he now looked calm. There was something in his eyes that Ethan couldn't quite understand. Something warm, something real. James sat down on the pavement beside Ethan, surprising him. A man in an expensive suit sitting on the dirty sidewalk was not something you saw every day. Hey, James said softly. Mind if I sit here? Ethan shrugged. It's not my sidewalk. James chuckled at that, then looked ahead at the fire trucks. For a while, neither of them spoke. They just sat there, watching as the firefighters finished their work. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, but Ethan could feel James thinking about something. Finally, James spoke. You know, when I was a kid, I didn't have much either. Ethan turned his head slightly, surprised. You didn't? James shook his head. No. My parents worked hard, but we barely had enough to survive. Some nights, we went to bed hungry. I had to grow up fast, just like you. He sighed. I know what it feels like, to not know where your next meal is coming from, to feel like you don't belong anywhere. Ethan looked down, unsure of what to say. He had never expected a rich man like James to understand what it felt like to struggle. James continued, but one day, someone gave me a chance. A man offered me a job at his small shop. He didn't have to, but he did. That job helped me change my life. I worked hard, saved money, and built everything I have today. He paused, then turned to Ethan. Now I want to do the same for you. Ethan's fingers tightened around Rusty's fur. Why? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Why do you care? James smiled. Because I see something in you, Ethan. You're brave. You have a good heart. You risked your life for my daughter when no one else did. That tells me everything I need to know about you. Ethan swallowed hard. He didn't know how to respond. His heart told him to trust James, but his mind reminded him of all the times he had been let down before. James stood up and dusted off his suit. "I'm not forcing you to do anything, Ethan," he said. "But if you ever want a home, a real home, our door is always open." With that, he gave Ethan one last nod and walked back to his family. Ethan watched him go, his heart pounding with uncertainty. For the first time in a long time, he had a choice to make. Ethan sat on the cold pavement long after James had walked away. His mind was full of thoughts, and his heart felt heavy. He had spent years living on the streets, learning to survive on his own. Now, for the first time, someone had offered him a home, a real chance at a better life. But could he trust it? Rusty nudged his hand with his nose, breaking Ethan's thoughts. The little dog looked up at him with his warm brown eyes, as if asking, "What now?" Ethan sighed and scratched Rusty's head. "I don't know, buddy," he whispered. "What do we do?" He looked over at the Caldwell family. Olivia was still in her mother's arms, safe and sound. James stood beside them, talking to the firefighters, but every now and then he glanced in Ethan's direction, as if waiting for him to decide. Ethan took a deep breath. He had nothing to lose. If things didn't work out, he could always go back to the life he knew. But what if this was real? What if, for the first time in years, someone truly wanted to help him? With one last look at Rusty, Ethan made up his mind. He slowly stood up, brushing the dust off his worn-out clothes. His legs were stiff, and his ankle still hurt from the fall, but he ignored it. He took a deep breath and walked toward James. James noticed him right away. A small smile formed on his lips, but he didn't say anything. He just waited. Ethan stopped in front of him, shifting uncomfortably. He wasn't good at asking for help, and the words felt strange in his mouth. Is Rusty welcome too?" Ethan finally asked, his voice quiet. James' smile widened. He crouched down and held out his hand to the little dog. Rusty sniffed it before wagging his tail happily. "Of course," James said warmly. "Rusty is part of the deal." Ethan let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. His fingers tightened around Rusty's fur as he nodded. "Okay," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll come with you." James placed a gentle hand on Ethan's shoulder. "You won't regret it," he promised. Emily smiled at him, and Olivia stepped forward, still holding onto her mother's hand. "I'm glad you're coming," she said softly. Ethan didn't know what to say, so he just gave a small nod. This was new for him. Having people care about him, having people see him. It felt strange, but deep down, he kind of liked it. The firefighters had finished their job, and a crowd had started to leave. The Caldwell family's house was badly damaged, but they still had other places to go. James led Ethan toward a sleek black car parked nearby. It was the kind of car Ethan had only ever seen from a distance, clean, shiny, and expensive. He hesitated before getting in, feeling out of place. James noticed and placed a reassuring hand on his back. "Come on," he said gently. "It's just a car." Ethan took a deep breath and stepped inside. The seats were soft, and the warmth inside the car made him realize just how cold he had been all night. Rusty jumped in after him, curling up beside him on the seat. As the car pulled away from the burned house, Ethan stared out the window. The city passed by, the familiar streets he had walked alone for years now feeling distant. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt something new. Ethan sat quietly in the back seat of the car as it moved through the city streets. The warmth inside made him feel sleepy, but his mind was too full of thoughts to rest. He glanced at Rusty, who was curled up beside him, already dozing off. The little dog's soft breathing was comforting. James and Emily sat in the front seats, talking in low voices. Olivia, who sat next to Ethan, kept sneaking glances at him as if she wanted to say something but wasn't sure how. After a moment, she finally spoke. "Have you always lived on the streets?" she asked. her voice gentle. Ethan hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, for a while. Olivia's eyes filled with sadness. That must have been really hard. Ethan shrugged. You get used to it. He didn't mean to sound cold, but he wasn't used to talking about his life. Most people either ignored him or looked at him with pity, but Olivia wasn't looking at him like that. She looked at him like a friend. Before he could say more, the car slowed down and pulled into a long driveway. Ethan's eyes widened. The house in front of them was massive. It wasn't just a house, it was a mansion. The lights from the windows made it glow in the night, and the neatly trimmed bushes lined a stone pathway leading to the entrance. Ethan swallowed hard. He had never been anywhere like this before. James turned around in his seat and smiled. Welcome home, Ethan. Home. The word felt strange to him. The driver opened the door, and Ethan stepped out, feeling small compared to the grand house in front of him. Rusty jumped down beside him, sniffing the air. Emily walked over and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. Come inside. You must be hungry. Ethan hesitated but nodded. He followed them up the steps and through the huge wooden doors. The moment he stepped inside, warmth wrapped around him. The house was bright, with soft carpets and elegant furniture. Everything smelled fresh, like flowers and something delicious cooking in the kitchen. A woman in a neat uniform walked toward them with a kind smile. Welcome home, Mr. Caldwell, she said. Then she looked at Ethan. And who is this? James smiled. This is Ethan. He'll be staying with us. The woman's smile widened. It's very nice to meet you, Ethan. My name is Maria. If you need anything, just let me know. Ethan nodded awkwardly. He wasn't used to people treating him like this. Maria led them to the dining room, where a warm meal was waiting. The table was set with steaming bowls of soup, fresh bread, and plates filled with food Ethan hadn't eaten in years. His stomach growled loudly, making Olivia giggle. Eat as much as you want, Emily said kindly. Ethan sat down, unsure at first, but as soon as he took the first bite, he couldn't stop. The food was rich and full of flavor. He hadn't realized how hungry he was until now. Rusty sat beside him, wagging his tail, and Maria brought him a small bowl of food as well. As Ethan ate, he listened to the Caldwell family talk and laugh. He wasn't used to this kind of warmth, this kind of kindness. It felt unreal. James noticed his silence and smiled. You don't have to feel out of place, Ethan, he said. This is your home now, too. Ethan looked down at his plate, his chest tightening. Home. Could this really be his new life? Could he really belong here? For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could. That night, Ethan lay in a warm, comfortable bed for the first time in years. The soft blankets covered him like a gentle hug, and the pillow felt like a cloud beneath his head. Rusty was curled up beside him, snoring quietly. But even with all this comfort, Ethan couldn't sleep. His mind was too full of thoughts. Everything had changed so quickly. Just yesterday, he was on the streets, struggling to find food, unsure of where he would sleep. And now he was here, in a house bigger than he could have ever imagined, with people who actually seemed to care about him. But was this really real? Could it last? He turned to look around the room. It was beautiful, large, with a big window that showed the night sky. A soft rug covered the floor, and there was even a desk and a bookshelf filled with books. Everything was neat and perfect, so different from the cold, hard streets he was used to. Ethan sat up and hugged his knees to his chest. He wasn't sure how to feel. He wanted to trust James and his family, but deep down, a part of him was scared. What if one day they changed their minds? What if they decided he didn't belong here? He had been let down before. Just then, there was a soft knock on the door. Ethan hesitated before saying, "Come in." The door opened slowly, and James stepped inside. He was dressed in a robe, his hair slightly messy, as if he had just gotten out of bed. "Can't sleep?" James asked gently. Ethan shook his head. Too much to think about. James smiled and sat on the chair near the bed. I understand. A lot has changed for you in just one night. Ethan looked down at his hands. I don't know if I belong here, he admitted in a quiet voice. James leaned forward, his eyes kind. Ethan, you saved my daughter's life. You showed courage, kindness, and strength when no one else did. That tells me more about you than anything else. He paused. This is your home now, but I won't force you to stay. The choice is always yours, but I hope you'll give us a chance. Ethan swallowed hard. No one had ever said that to him before. James continued, I don't expect you to trust us overnight. I know life hasn't been fair to you, but I want you to know that you don't have to fight alone anymore. Ethan felt a lump in his throat. He wasn't used to this. Kindness without conditions, help without expectations. After a moment, he finally spoke. I think I'd like to stay. James smiled warmly. That makes me very happy. He stood up and patted Ethan's shoulder. Get some rest. Tomorrow is a new day. Ethan nodded, and James walked to the door. Before he left, he turned back. Good night, Ethan. For the first time in years, someone had said those words to him. Ethan lay back down, pulling the blanket up to his chin. Rusty let out a small sigh and snuggled closer. For the first time in a long time, Ethan felt safe. He didn't know what the future held, but for now, he wasn't alone. He had a place to call home. And for the first time in his life, he truly believed that things were going to be okay.